I decided to start reading judgments in legal cases, and it quickly disabused me of my notion that judges were very wise human beings. And because you can see in a lot of judgments that a lot of kind of rather silly things can be said. And the Abbey Lara might be one of them. I agree, in fact, with the majority in that judgment that it would have been ridiculous for a Dole or an Oireachtas committee to be able to find that an named individual had unlawfully killed somebody, but the court did misunderstand the role of Parliament in quite a significant way when it talked about the Parliament being a legislature. And it misunderstands what legislatures, parliaments throughout the world do nowadays, and it took quite a literal interpretation of the Constitution, and then it decides sometimes when it suits it, it doesn't take a literal interpretation of the Constitution. So in that case, the Doherty judgment last year, where the court was going to ask the government to force TDs to vote in a particular way, didn't seem to observe the niceties of the separation of powers. But I also agree with John in that I think the Supreme Court judgment did leave some scope for the Oireachtas to go back into court and try something again, but the Oireachtas was just scared and didn't really do anything. But what I want to talk about today is what I'm here to talk about today is the sort of political aspect of it, what parliaments do, what happens in other countries, how they work in other countries, and specifically I want to kind of finish up on a point that why this amendment, so this amendment is or was being sold to us before the election and after the election as some way of liberating the Dáil and empowering the Dáil, and I will argue that in fact that won't happen, and I'll say why it won't happen at all. So what do parliaments do? They do a couple of things. The main thing that they do is make and break governments. And so if you read the Constitution, a lot of the Constitution is devoted to how governments are formed and how we get rid of governments. And so that's well and truly covered in the Irish Constitution and in virtually every kind of parliamentary democracy, the constitutions of virtually every parliamentary democracies. Parliaments also allegedly legislate. And again, there are specific procedures about how laws get passed, what it has to do if there are disagreements between various bodies, what should happen. And so again, a lot of space and time is given to its legislative function. Of course, in reality, it doesn't legislate, nor do legislatures in other parliamentary democracies. If you look at where nearly every act of the Oireachtas has come from, it has come from government, and every bill that comes from government is passed, and pretty much passed unamended. There are amendments, but usually ones that where they've discovered that the ombudsman, the parliamentary draftsman, made a small error or just tightening things up. You don't tend to see major amendments on the basis of a Dáil debate or a Dáil intervention. You rarely, if ever, there are a couple of exceptions, you rarely, if ever, see acts of the Oireachtas emerge from the opposition or from backbenchers. So the Dáil as such does not legislate, and Ireland isn't unusual here. The parliaments in nearly, I think it's safe enough to say, all parliamentary democracies don't actually do legislative functions. In the last 100 years, that has been, for quite good reasons, transferred to government. And the first two bits are dealt with quite clearly in the Irish Constitution. The second bit, the other things that parliaments do, or TDs do, or members of parliament do, aren't given quite so much space. So to represent constituents is something that our TDs spend a lot of time doing, and in fact MPs in many countries spend a lot of time doing. We often think that it's a peculiarly Irish phenomenon, and maybe some aspects of it are peculiarly Irish, but even in the UK, you do see a lot of clinical surgeries, they call them, and it's quite common. But probably the most important day-to-day power that a Parliament has is to scrutinise government. Now, there isn't a huge there is not an awful lot of the Constitution is given over to it. Arguably, Article 28(4)(1), which says the government will be responsible to the Dáil, essentially gives it that power, the power to scrutinise. And we can see that power is operationalised by parliamentary questions, through Dáil debates, questions to leaders, various things like that. And again, the scrutiny function is one that is important in Ireland, and is one that is important in parliamentary democracies throughout the world. And in order to enable that to happen, what you tend to see is that parliamentary committees tend to get set up. And so parliamentary committees have emerged really as something that are far more important in the last 40 years throughout Europe and kind of established parliamentary democracies. We see that they allow for some sort of policy specialisation. They give the people something to do. It's a good way of training people to be ministers because they can specialise in a specific area. And they are also sometimes empowered to scrutinise, or often empowered to scrutinise the implementation of policy and the use and misuse of public funds. And so this has become especially important in the last 40 years as parliaments realise that their power has been depleted and has gone to government, and so they were given something to do. And so in Ireland they were set up in the 1980s. Well, there had been a sort of committee system, but it didn't work terribly well. And then after the arms crisis, there was a kind of fear of dealing with any types of committees. And so they kind of came around, and in the 1980s were given a bit more power in the 1990s, and they tended to have been given more and more power since then. So one of the things that you tend to see in committees doing, or parliaments doing, is that there will be ad hoc committees set up to investigate certain things of public importance. And so Ireland would be very unusual if it didn't have the right to inquire into these things. As John said, a lot of the time these are explicitly put into European constitutions or into Parliament and the constitutions of other parliamentary democracies, but also you see that they are not put in, but you still observe the right to parliamentary inquiries in some countries, even though there's nothing explicit there. When they happen in countries, and they happen in most countries, it's probably just in Norway, Sweden, Finland, that they tend not to happen. And there they do not happen because of the power of the ombudsman. So the ombudsman is in those countries, in Scandinavian countries, Finland is the Scandinavian, in Nordic countries, you see that the ombudsman has a great deal of power, and what might be otherwise given to ad hoc investigative committees tends to be done by the ombudsman in those countries. But everywhere else we tend to see them happening. And if we're trying to determine whether these things are important or not, there are a few things that we will see in those. Some countries allow the compellability of witnesses. They allow access to all documentation, so including perhaps cabinet minutes, not that any are actually kept. The other major issue is the determination of the terms of reference and who gets to and who has the power to establish one. So in most countries, the rule is that the Parliament, a majority in Parliament, decides whether the Parliament can establish an ad hoc investigative committee. But what you tend to see then is, unsurprisingly, in parliamentary democracies where the legislature and the executive are fused and the executive controls the legislature, what happens is you tend not to see very many parliamentary inquiries into matters of government business. So as a way of scrutinising government, this doesn't really happen. And so in practice what happens is these tend to be, you only see really important ones occur in cases where the government has a minority, is a minority government. It doesn't have a majority in Parliament. And so there are some famous cases in Portugal, in Denmark and in Germany where the government had lost its majority, and then Parliament decided to inquire into government actions, but rarely do you actually see Parliament inquiring into government actions in most other countries, because its government determines who is one of the terms of reference and who is going to be on the inquiry and whether there will be an inquiry allowed. There are some exceptions. So, for instance, in Germany, 25% of the TDs, of the MPs in the Bundestag can call for an inquiry. And, I mean, it's something that it is usually limited, so they can't continuously call for an inquiry. So you're only allowed to be part of that 25% once every couple of years, I think. I'm not sure what the exact rules are. But in Germany, a minority, so essentially the opposition, can inquire into government action. So, so what impact will it have on government oversight? Well, I said at the outset, probably none. Why? Well, we haven't seen the legislation that's going to be attached to this, have we? As the draft bill, okay. But I'm assuming that that draft bill will say something like the majority of the Dáil, or a majority in the Dáil, or a majority in both houses of the Oireachtas will decide on one of the terms of reference, and also whether there will be an inquiry into that area. Which means again that the government will have a veto. It will decide when something will happen. So if we can think of examples of what we might want to inquire on, what we might think would be appropriate for the Dáil to inquire on, we can see last year in the commission, the banking inquiry, which was set up, had the Oireachtas chosen to do it itself, it would have been appropriate, one would think, if the purpose of the Dáil is to scrutinise government action, it would have been appropriate for it to include the decision on the bank guarantee scheme. So it would have been something that we would have wanted the Dáil to inquire on. We might have wanted the Dáil to inquire on. Now, one, it wasn't allowed because the government said you can inquire on everything except this, except what government has done. But we can also think, what if it had decided to do this, whether it would have been a good mechanism to actually find out anything about that decision, the banking crisis. So you could have predicted quite easily that Sean Fitzpatrick would have been invited as a witness. And you could have seen the queues of TDs and senators standing outside ready to go on camera showing that they were going to call this bastard whatever they wanted to call him, and I'm sure some of them would have ventured to tears or anger just to kind of demonstrate how angry his constituents or her constituents are. And it would have been made maybe good TV viewing, and most of us would have enjoyed it, at least the TDs and senators themselves. But it arguably would have generated more heat than light, and we wouldn't have actually found out anything about the banking crisis. And so we might ask ourselves, what way should we do these things? If we do, and I think most people agree, that it is a job of the Parliament to scrutinise government, how can it do it? And so I came up with a rather basic sort of diagram, where it's trying to think about where you obviously, I mean, in the amendment it says matters of great public importance. Probably the decision of Roy Keane to leave the Irish soccer camp in Saipan in 2002 was a matter of great public importance. In fact, it was so much a matter of great public importance that our then great Taoiseach decided to intervene and offer his world-class skills at consensus building and conciliation to them. But it isn't something that we would assume that the Oireachtas should be inquiring into. The Oireachtas is meant to be inquiring into government actions, the actions or failures of government policy. So it should be something public in the sense that it involves the state. And more often than not, you can see we kind of distinguish when we talk about parliamentary oversight, we distinguish between police patrols and fire brigades, or fire engines, whatever they're called. And so one of the things that one wants to do when setting up public policy is to have continuous peer review, and so that it's easy for people to say you could introduce watchdog whistleblower rather legislation to enable good peer review, and this should prevent policy failures. But say we have a policy failure, then we might assume that there would be some sort of internal accountability procedure, which may or may not work. And so the Gardaí now would have the Garda Ombudsman who would do that sort of job and might produce a report which would go to the department, and the department might then react in some way, either by making some sort of statement about it, changing policy, disciplining somebody, or whatever it has the power to do. And then you might see some Oireachtas involvement in that the minister will be questioned, what did you do about this report, can you lay this report before the House, various things like that. And then probably only where the departmental response, the minister's response, is insufficient, might you have some sort of ad hoc public inquiry. But if you are doing it, then what way do you want to do it? So we could have a banking crisis inquiry where TDs and senators get to ask their questions, and I've watched a lot of these, not so much the inquiries, but the just committee, general day-to-day committee proceedings, and what you tend to see is they all know exactly when they're going to be given their 5 minutes to ask questions, so they wander in for their 5 minutes and then wander out very often, not bothering to answer the question. In fact, I was in front of one of these ones, and I was asked a question, the guy left, and I looked at the chairman and kind of said, should I bother answering? He obviously doesn't care. And he said, oh, just do it for procedure anyway, and so I did. So parliamentary inquiries, the judges always think that they're very good at doing everything, and are quite derogatory about politicians, and seem to think that politics is a dirty word or a dirty profession. I'm with Brian Cowan on this. I think it's a very noble profession. But I probably agree that politicians aren't always best placed to inquire into certain areas. And what you do tend to see, even their choice of inquiries tend not to be great. So again, if we look at a pretty prominent inquiry, ad hoc inquiry that was set up, was, I can't remember what it was actually called, but it was into the fall of the Spring Reynolds government. And it didn't do anything other than political point scoring. There was no purpose to the inquiry, really. All it did was a sort of sop to the Labour Party to enable them to sort of get their side of the story out in some sort of public forum. But I wonder if they aren't the best people always to be asking the questions, and they have other things to do. They have maybe they're quite busy and they don't have time to be kind of dealing with the various procedures that might be involved in an inquiry. Would they be better off just inducing, is the wrong term, sponsoring an inquiry that would be actually done by other people? So Parliament could sponsor an inquiry such as the Banking Commission, and we could ensure perhaps that they might inquire into things that we care about, i.e. things that the government don't want to be scrutinised, by allowing a minority, 25% say, decide what the inquiry will be on. We could then ask, if it is going to some outside body, should it be judges or specialists? I'd argue that judges are probably the last people you want, because judges tend to be overly procedural. They are also used to adversary, and so if an inquiry is inquisitorial in nature, somebody with an adversarial kind of training might not be the best person. Whereas specialists, it might be easier, say for instance, if there is an inquiry into banking, having somebody who is a banking specialist talking to another person who is in banking, they will possibly be more likely to, one, know what they're talking about, each other are talking about, and open up to each other. Then there are obvious issues about whether these should be in private or in public. There's obvious good arguments for holding them in public, but you might also argue that things held in private might also yield, get closer to the truth. So, I suppose to sum up, arguably there are serious problems with the decision, but I'm still surprised that the government did not try and go to court on this. It seems to get scared, and I think it's possibly going too far in feeling that it needs to have an explicit reference in the Constitution. But again, the Constitution is what the judges say it is. But if we are going to change something like this, I would not expect it to have any impact. There won't be any impact unless you actually see that a minority in Parliament is allowed to set terms of references and set up inquiries themselves. Thanks.